thought I might just start by asking each of the panellists, this is practice for short answers, to ask each of the panellists if they wanted to give me a couple of words for how they would sum up the overall mood of the sector in WA at the moment.
WA.
Who wants to start? Do you want to start?
I would say it's upbeat and very collegiate.
Mm-hmm.
Deb, you're going to be struggling for words at the end. I would agree, collegiate and positive.
And I would concur with that. I think we're on the cusp of a very significant period of growth and development for WA universities.
What words do I have left? Collaborative is a good one. Something that I witnessed very early on arriving here is the way in which universities collaborate, but also how the state government is very supportive of that collaboration, as is the Governor, Her Excellency, who meets with the Vice-Chancellors twice a year in the spirit of collaboration and enabling that collaboration around universities.
And I would add, absolutely optimistic in the WA context. I think we do collaborate extremely well, and I think we are all committed to being more than the sum of the parts.
Fantastic, thank you. Celia, I might throw to you first. Each of these universities you run are different. Yours in some ways stands out by being a private university, the other's public. And so I guess there's two things about that I'd be interested in you exploring. One is how different do you think that makes UNDA and how you would mark that difference. And the second is the 2014 federal government reforms would have put the private sector on a much more level playing field with the public universities. Those reforms didn't pass the Parliament, and I just wonder if you have any reflections on where you think the private sector now sees itself in the university system.
Thanks, Robert. As you know, the terminology of describing a university as a private university in the Australian higher education sector can be a little bit misleading. Mm-hmm. Notre Dame was established by an Act of Parliament, like all the other 4 universities in Western Australia, and 99% of regulatory and accreditation quality standards apply to Notre Dame as apply to the other universities. I think we're slightly let off in having to make our financial records public, and for those media out here who ring up all the time wanting our financial records, because we're not compelled, we don't feel compelled to supply them. So to the extent, we still describe ourselves as private, because notwithstanding that we had an Act of Parliament and notwithstanding all of these regulatory requirements imposed on us, Notre Dame was established by a group of, the force behind it was a group of individuals, private individuals, who worked with politicians, worked with the government to actually get the university established. We got no endowed land from the state. And in fact, for the first 10 years of our existence, no students got any support from the government to actually attend university. So they were all full fee-paying students, and the university was given no additional support from the Commonwealth Government. Over time, we do, and courtesy of governments of all different flavours, for which we are forever grateful, we have increased the number of Commonwealth supported places that we have available to our students. So 60% of our domestic undergraduate students would now be on Commonwealth supported places in the same way as all other universities. Coming back to your question though, so this is the description. We do believe, because I firmly believe that the historical development of each of our universities has shaped each of our universities as they are today. Now that doesn't mean we don't innovate, doesn't mean that we don't adapt and change, but it does help establish the culture, it helps establish the priorities and the essence and what draws particular people to each university. So the background of the university certainly has shaped Notre Dame and what it does. And I think one of the enduring aspects of it is that when we started, we had to compete for students on an uneven playing field. I mean, and I'm not complaining, we went into that with full knowledge. But it meant that the quality of what we gave students had to be superb. For them to come to us and take out private loans to pay our fees, not that they were excessive, but they had, you know, a lot of them were loans. We actually had to really perform in our teaching, in our support for students, pastoral care, student services. And that being part of our history has become part of our DNA. And, you know, I don't want to, although Paul will no doubt tell you that they're number one ranking in somewhere, as will. So we all travelled to Indonesia recently together with the Minister, and the amount of times we all heard about each university being number one in something, number one. And so I do it in that context. I think that part of our DNA still sets us aside, that it's firmly in our culture, it's firmly in our DNA that students are first, that our teaching and our teaching results as they come through Quilt, and that's where I'm talking about being first in the state on quite a number of those criteria, teaching, graduate outcomes, employment rates, that has affected us. So is that a roundabout? Did I even come close to answering your question, Robert? Lie if I didn't.
That was a fantastic answer, thank you. And I think you just took it as a Dorothy. There's actually one Dorothy I've lined up with another of the panel members. So
Oh, okay. Well,
that's fine.
maybe my political training is getting better then. Not answering questions. Isn't that right, Minister?
So there's...
I'm not accusing you of that. It's the political class.
So we'll moving right along. There's two more questions I wanted to ask about the where we find ourselves post the big attempt at reform in 2014. And then we might get on with the sector, because of course I think the point you all made is that in fact the sector's very strong here. But there is this kind of unresolved set of discussions about higher education policy. Stephen, for Edith Cowan University's point of view, you weren't one of the big sort of public contributors to the debate. In terms of the part of the sector you represent in WA, I was interested in where you think the population, the community that you serve, and the universities that you would align yourself with nationally, where you see the reform process being up to in higher education these days.
Okay, so I think we have to go back to 2014 when the reform process started, and it wasn't done in a particularly edifying way, if I can say that. I'm a recent arrival, so I'm looking at it with external eyes. But I think if you ask where we want to be, I think everybody in the university sector in Australia wants to have a bit of stability now, because we haven't had that for a while. I think we'd like the system to be equitable. We would like it to be affordable. And most of all, we'd like high quality with that. So those are the four things I think we want to get out of it. I think you have to realise that the reform is still ongoing. It's only been put on hold, and we will no doubt see things happening in this Parliament. The issue, of course, then is that how do you deal with the fact that there's a 3.2 billion cut that was planned in 2014 and is still there in the government's books, planned in the future as a saving. So we're going to lose $3.2 billion, which is about 20% of the Commonwealth grant scheme funding that universities get. Now, if you go back to what I said, a stable, fair, equitable, high-quality system, I'm not sure you can do that if you suddenly lose $3.2 billion. So there has to be a way of allowing the sector to cope with that. Now, as you know, in the reforms earlier, with difficulty trying to get it through Senate and it failed, there was the idea that you would allow the fees to rise, and you could fill that 20% gap with revenue you raised from students. I think we have to have a grown-up debate in Australia and not go through the process we went previously. So I would hope we don't have the problems in the Senate and government we had with the reforms, that we need to get them done and we need to get stability. And I guess that grown-up debate is how you fund high-quality, affordable education in a progressive, modern country. And it seems to me there are two people who should be paying or contributing. higher education is a good for society. I think we'd all agree with that. If anybody wants to put their hand up and disagree, no, okay, so we're happy with that. We think higher education is good for society. And therefore society should bear some of the cost, and that would be via the government. So that's fine. We accept that the government should make some contribution. But I think we'd also accept, and the statistics show that this is the case, that it's also an individual good. Our students do well. And I think, I'm not even going to ask you to put your hand up about that. I'm going to take it as a given that we think the individual gets a lot out of that. So therefore, the real core of the debate now is how do we fund it in a fair distribution between the individual paying and the state paying? And I think that's where the debate will go. At the moment, the state, of course, bears more of the cost than the individual, but we have to get to a fair and equitable system. I don't want to get to a system like the US where there is now over $1 trillion worth of debt, at least half of which will never be repaid. So we need to avoid that in whatever system we do. And I'd finish with one thing that I'm very passionate about, and that's a demand-led system, a non-rationed system. If you look at systems where they are rationed, where numbers are capped, it's usually the low socioeconomic groups that don't do well out of that. So if we want to promote social mobility in the future in Australia, I think we should do everything we can to protect the demand-led system. Now, I think that's generally held across the universities of Australia. I've heard some odd things from the Group of 8. Maybe Paul would like to reassure us that the Group of 8 agree with the rest of the universities of Australia that the demand-led system is a good thing. But I think it shouldn't be beyond the wit of a great nation like Australia, and it is great, it is innovative, it's in a very good place for us to come up with a system where we can have some stability, an equitable system, a system that's affordable and delivers high quality. We should be able to do that.
Thank you. I was going to go to Paul next. My recollection of the debate that followed the 2014 reforms being introduced, there was a very strong and clear voice from UWA and yourself, Paul, arguing that there was a strong equity case for the reforms. That argument didn't find favour in the Senate, clearly. And now Go8 has repositioned itself, though to exactly what extent is not entirely clear to me. I was just wondering if you want to talk about where you think UWA sees itself now as the local Go8 university, and where you would see the reform process going over the next, the life of this parliament.
Well, let me begin with the end of that. Where do I see the reform issue going over the life of this parliament? Is that working? Just, yes. I'm not optimistic. If you look at the composition of the crossbenchers in the Senate, I think getting any higher education policy through this Senate will be more difficult than it was for the previous Senate. And higher education has been intensely politicised over the last 5 or 6 years in Parliament, and I think we will all suffer from that. So about that, I'm not terribly optimistic. In terms of where we've come from 2014, of course, the sector was unanimous in opposing the 20% funding cut, and we remain unanimous in opposing that. What we did at UWA was say, well, if this reform is going to be legislated as proposed, what will the impact be? Because we were facing questions from many quarters from students, as indeed were many universities. The question was, what does this mean for us as prospective students? And how would you implement this? So we came out with a very clear statement as to what we would charge, and then what we would do with the additional revenue that came from that charging in terms of a scholarship scheme. And this touches on the equity element. What we said was that out of the scholarship scheme that would be built out of the additional fee revenue, we would establish a system of accommodation bursaries for all regional students from regional WA coming to the University of Western Australia. Because it is clear that we have significant socio-economic challenges in terms of equity and participation in universities. But here in Western Australia, we also have a geographic challenge. because all of our universities are located in Perth. Almost all of our operations are in Perth. Curtin has, of course, the Kalgoorlie School of Mines, which is the largest non-metropolitan-based higher education enterprise now. But for most students, for most subjects, they have to come to Perth. And if you're a regional student, that means you have to sustain at least $15,000 of direct cash costs week by week to pay for your accommodation. And it is a major barrier, and it affects significantly the opportunities that regional students have. So that's what we were going to do in terms of equity and participation. We wanted transparency in terms of what we would be charging. I think transparency is going to be an increasingly important issue in higher education in Australia. I think we can look at the UK and see what the National Student Survey there has done in terms of opening up a lot of information and through the consumer power of students, forced universities to become more open in what they do, in how they select, in how they support students, in how they monitor teaching, and so on and so forth. I think, Cynthia, that the QUILT database that the government has now established on learning and teaching is just the opening element of what will happen in Australia. At UWA, we've now started to publish a full set of the ATAR, the median and upper and lower ATAR bands for entry into our university. UNSW has done this for a little while. And that responds to some concerns that Senator Birmingham has been raising, not about Western Australia, but about New South Wales universities not giving clear information to students. So I would say transparency is going to be very important. Just in terms of Steve's comments on the Group of Eight, the Group of Eight is absolutely committed to equity, access, and the demand-driven system. The question mark is really around how does that demand-driven system get taken into the future? And one of the big challenges that we have in the sector, which is a challenge and it comes down to some of the issues we have with federalism, is at sub-degree level, the intersection between the higher education sector, which is funded from the federal government, and the vocational sector, which is funded primarily at a state level and organised at a state level. And I don't think we have a good way anywhere in Australia of providing the best information for students to make choices and to give them a level playing field in terms of choices, in terms of the funding opportunities. That, I think, is where a lot of work needs to be done, and it really requires state and federal cooperation.
Before we leave the kind of reform landscape and start picking out some sort of specific issues about your universities in this environment, the second half of the question, Celia, was about the how you think the, albeit fairly heterogeneous thing we call the private sector sees the pathway from here. Do you want to just have a go at that one as well?
Yeah, the reforms, when they were put forward in 2014, we were one of the supporters of obviously retention of the demand-driven system. But we also argued that it should be extended beyond what is commonly referred to as the public university system. So Notre Dame is not a part of the demand-driven system. We're given an allocation of CSPs each year for our students. Our point being is that a true demand-driven system, which is student demand-driven, is that a student can walk anywhere and get enrolled, so it truly is student choice. So the demand-driven system that we currently have isn't a full and fair demand-driven system because not all players in higher education are actually eligible for it. Now, I should make the footnote here. When I talk about private, I in my mind, and in my thoughts, think about private not-for-profit entities. I do think that there is an issue with opening up, and we expressed it at the time, of opening up the full demand-driven system for for-profit entities and to higher education providers which aren't universities. And my issues with that doesn't mean that they shouldn't have access, but that the funding's provided and the regulatory requirements and the monitoring of it might be slightly different than that which is provided and given to universities. So we did support, may continue to support the demand-driven system, but our argument is that it should be a true demand-driven system and not one that is just limited to what is known as the public universities. Our second thing was that we did support fee deregulation, which not all universities did, and there were often some really interesting discussions at universities in Australia and at other forums about fee deregulation. And when I'm saying the university supported it, that doesn't certainly mean that every academic or every student at the university would have supported fee deregulation. But we did support it with the proviso that there are some soft caps, that there was consideration of soft caps or ways to monitor it both from a federal budget perspective, because we don't want to go into the trillions, just like Stephen said, but also we don't want to fleece students. One of the things that always entertained me in an ironical way when we were talking about fee deregulation was all these vice-chancellors who would come out and say, oh, well, students are just going to end up paying, you know, we don't want students, future students paying a fortune. And I'm sitting there thinking, who sets your fees at your institution? If you're that concerned about it, adopt a policy and put in place practices to make sure that doesn't happen. Now, I may be a bit naive here, and yes, we can't control what happens in 10 years' time when we all pass on from our current positions, or earlier as it may be. I think I'll be leaving this afternoon. But as I say, that did cause me a wry smile, thinking, okay, you are in control of your fee setting. So if you are concerned about students, put your money where your mouth is, and UWA came out and set a policy. I hate complimenting Paul, but I just have. UWA came out and adopted a specific approach as to what they would take. So I think I have just answered your question on
fully.
this.
Thank you. Yeah. So before we leave that subject, I just want Eeva, Debbie, do any of others want to pick up that there was an issue that Paul hung out there about the intersection between the higher education system and the VET system, and what happens with those sub-degree programs, which are different in their funding. They're also different in a regulatory sense, you know, the role of curriculum versus skills, and in the way the economy is going. This is not a question I've forecast, but it just struck me as a sort of a statement hanging there, whether anybody wanted to take up that challenge.
Maybe
from the point of view of your...
I could make a comment on that, excuse me. Just to say that given that there is a bit of a challenge in Western Australia around attainment in schools, and then the flow through of that to universities, you know, if you look at the data, we know that Western Australian propensity for students to go to university is about 48%. And that compares about 95% in Queensland, and over 60% in Victoria, 66% in fact, and over 60% in New South Wales and ACT. So when you look at that landscape, I think there is a particular imperative for having some really strong provision at the sub-degree level, because we are talking about pathways into universities and opening up those pathways by having sub-degree as part of the demand-driven system. And as we know, Tasmania is actually performing the worst of all the states in terms of school leavers going to university, about 40%. And in that context, University of Tasmania is to have a big framework for sub-degree provision, which they have just recently announced. So I think there's a real sort of imperative and connection there. But also, I think there is a need to have a careful look at how policy can be connected and strategy can be connected from schools to higher education and also to economic development. And I think that's something that, again, is something that Western Australia, like other states, need to look at carefully. And again, it plays to that question about widening access as well.
And no, Robert, I'm happy to also add to the answer. I mean, my view, and I said it at the time in 2014, I think there does need to be a more joined up tertiary education sector. But I agree with Paul, you've got some pretty complicated state and Commonwealth factors here to consider, and I think what we did learn from the 2014 reforms is that that aspect of it was not well thought through. And I would like us to, in a sense, we do need to address the issue, whether opening up in a demand-driven sense all universities to offering more than enabling courses, I'm not sure is the answer. Quite frankly, I'm not sure that universities are really best placed to offer associate degrees and diplomas. It's not our core business, and there's many examples around the country of us not doing that particularly well. So, my view is it does have to be a more joined up system, but you need to go back to first principles to understand how best to implement that kind of system into the future, and there are big complexities in terms of state and federal responsibilities.
Thank you. Eva, congratulations on your appointment to Murdoch. You've just come from Wollongong. I just wonder if there's any reflections you have at this early point of your tenure as to the difference in environment from a kind of regional city university in Wollongong to Murdoch.
Yes, well, thank you very much for that, and I have to say that the welcome to Western Australia has been very warm, and I'm very appreciative of that. University of Wollongong is an interesting university insofar that it's the same age as Murdoch University, 41 years old, and it's a university that not many people know the name of, and there's a resonates, it doesn't come to everybody's lips immediately, the word Wollongong. So, and not to mention even being able to pronounce it. So, but however, University of Wollongong is very well known, and I think it used a lot of good strategies, and some of those strategies were particularly around brand building, high quality research in very selected areas, and also a very, very strong role in the city of Wollongong. You may know that Wollongong was a very strong steel city, and that industry is going quite fast. So the university is seen as playing a key role in regeneration of the city through knowledge economy. And that again resonates a little bit in my mind with Western Australia and some of the challenges around resources and resource industries. And one thing that I certainly learned from Wollongong, but also from my time at one of the universities in the United Kingdom, which was University of Hertfordshire, again in a city which lost its main base for economic existence actually, and that was the British Aerospace. And again, the university played a major role in regeneration. So a couple other things around the eastern states particularly. I would say that there is a great investment from state, and particularly match funding type of investment from state in New South Wales. I would say that there was also a real appreciation and understanding the value of international education as a benefit to society, but also from the economic imperative. We know that international education is the third biggest export industry in Australia, and I think is the biggest one in Victoria. So I think I know that there's a strategy in Western Australia on its way for international education. The minister is leading that work very rigorously, but I would say that there is a space there to step up and perhaps have a bit of a look at what's happening in the eastern states. Victoria, for instance, has an office, a minister for international education and tourism. And I think, again, that link, policy and strategy link between international education and tourism, for instance, is something that we certainly need to look at very, very carefully. So, and also I think the point that I mentioned earlier around having the educational attainment in schools as owned by the whole of the community, and that includes the universities. And I was very encouraged when I first arrived here and looked at the Western Australia higher education strategy, and I think it's the first goal which talks about the university's role in raising attainment and aspiration in schools. So that is a very positive part of, I think, that experience. I would very much encourage us to think about universities, and I did witness this quite a bit in the eastern states. Think about universities not just the entry on a budget line, but actually really key and central to the economic and social well-being of societies. And I think that is something, once you manage to get that mindset shift, I have personally experienced, particularly in the United Kingdom, a great shift in ways in which business, industry, universities and governments start to work together. Great things flow from that. So maybe those are just some reflections new to Western Australia, but also some lessons that I have learned from the East and also from the United Kingdom.
Thank you. So Paul said transparency was going to be a theme, and I might be transparent now and say, at the rate we're going through the questions at the moment, we're not going to kind of finish
Yes.
all of the ones that I suggested.
Right.
But the conversation's really good. So what we might do is I might just pick out some of the ones we're going to talk about, so we make sure we have some time for the audience. So forgive me if I've suggested a topic that we don't then cover. I was wondering, Debbie, international education's just come up. It's something that Curtin's always been very forceful about participating in, and so you see yourself as a leader in it. I just wonder if you have any particular reflections on where you think international education's at in this market at the moment.
No, it's a good question, thank you, Robert, and a bit of a Dorothy Dixer, I have to say, as well for me. Obviously, Curtin has been a forerunner in this space, and in fact, one of my predecessors at Curtin, Don Watts, tells quite an entertaining story about how he convinced the Commonwealth Government that, in fact, the Australian education sector could open itself up to international students. And of course, Curtin's got two well-developed international campuses. And for me, to go and visit our campus in Malaysia, East Malaysia, it's amazing what we're achieving there. There's close to 5,000 science and engineering students, and the graduates, and the impact they're having is just phenomenal. I think in terms of what international students are looking for, they are essentially looking for a high quality and well-regulated sector. And that's what we have in Australia. We're well-regulated, we deliver quality, we're a safe destination, we've got international recognition of our qualifications, we've got vibrant campuses, and that's what international students are looking for. And as Eeva's indicated, globally, in fact, Australia is the third largest provider of international education. So on the global scene, we're a small player, but we are the third largest provider of international education. And then if we look at our own economy, international education is Australia's third largest export sector, after only iron ore and coal, ahead of agriculture, ahead of gas, and ahead of many other things. So it's incredibly important. As Eeva said, it's number 1 in Victoria. It's number 8 here in Western Australia. And if we go back 10 years and look at the data, 2005, Western Australia was 10% of Australia's population, and we had that number of international students. Fast forward 10 years, we are now 11% of Australia's population, and we have 6.8% of Australia's international students. So something has happened, and as Eeva said, the Minister has absolutely been leading this. We have to change it. And I think it's how we can work together, and as we all said at the beginning, that's one of the things that makes us all very optimistic. We are collegiate, we are collaborative. But Perth is not seen to be a study destination. It's just not. If you look at the QS 2015 rankings of the world's most livable cities, we all love living in Perth. Melbourne was number 2. Sydney was number 4, Perth was last in Australia at number 38. So we've got to work together to ensure that we are able to build international education, as an important part of how we diversify our economy here in the state, but also how we support the vibrancy of our campuses, of our society. It's a wonderful vehicle for soft diplomacy, all of those things that are critical. we've got to do more about it. It's about student accommodation. It's about building that brand of study Perth as a destination, working with Tourism WA. So I think we've really slipped, and it's something that as I say, I've really appreciated the leadership from the Minister. It's something I think we can turn around pretty quickly, and as I say, in an environment where we're all keen to see the state's economy improving, this is something we need to do.
Thank you. It's a big topic in both federal and state sort of political discussion at the moment is growing innovation, innovation economy. And I'm interested in comments from a couple of you. Others may want to then chip in. Paul, you're the kind of local representative of the research-intensive GO8. The Prime Minister, this is one of the Prime Minister's sort of signature areas of policy go forward. What do you think, what does UWA, what do you think the GO8 want to see out of the next Parliament in terms of innovation economy and the role of the universities and research?
Well, rather than say anything about the Group of 8, what I would say is that I think here in Western Australia, all the universities are deeply engaged in the innovation opportunities. I mean, in fact, if you look across the WA universities, we have deeper engagement with industry than is the norm across the Australian sector. And now we're advantaged by the fact that we have some very large businesses located here in Perth, particularly in the energy and mineral sector. And it's easier to engage with a large business around innovation than a small business. And we all do that to a very large degree. We have deep connections. We have a lot of co-research with industry. We have a lot of internships. And we get a lot of research funding from them. So we are already very, I would say, active in the innovation part of the engagement space with industry. I think as we look at the federal government, the National Innovation and Science Agenda is great on words. It's less good when it comes to action, though, of course, we wait to see what will come out in this government, and Minister Hunt, no doubt, will be announcing some interesting developments in the future. There are some hopes around more effective use of the R&D tax incentives, for instance, to encourage business to engage more deeply than it currently does with industry. Here within WA, though, the state government is also very focused on innovation. Minister Marmion convened an innovation summit 2 weeks ago. All our universities were heavily represented at that, along with business, along with investors and so on. And I actually think the opportunities here in WA are very strong, particularly around what you might call startup innovation. I think they're strong because WA has a very long history of investing in speculative enterprises. Most of those speculative enterprises in the past have involved drilling holes in the ground in search of new mineral resources. But there is actually a well-developed network of investment capital here in WA. And what we have an opportunity to do, and I think we're all working on that, is to provide those investors with very good opportunities to put their money behind some of the innovation work that's done in all our universities in information technology, in biotechnology, in biomedical engineering, and a whole range of other areas. That's why I said at the beginning, I think West Australian universities are on the cusp of a very exciting growth period, and I think we should be able to do better and move more quickly than universities in the East Coast.
Thank you. Debbie, do you want to add anything to that from I appreciate your speaking here in geographical solidarity rather than from a group of universities' point of view. That's a theme of the lunch already. But, Technology University, just wondering if Curtin has any particular sort of angles on this.
Yeah, no, thank you, Robert. And again, I would agree with, much of what Paul said. And I think this is an agenda where WA as a whole and our institutions are well prepared to really, I think, take a leadership role. I think, though, you know, much of the debate at the national level, and I think many people would be aware of this, is really focused on the fact that industry doesn't work as well as it should with universities, and it's often turned round to universities don't work as well with industry as they should. Now, you know, I think Ian Chubb, as former chief scientist, had this right when he said it takes three to tango. It's not just the university's issue, it's not just industry's issue, it's actually, we've got to get government right, so government's got to get the policy settings right. We do need to look at the R&D tax, that's absolutely critical, and that work has to be done. We've got to have a clear roadmap for how we support research infrastructure, because that is critical to the innovation of the future, supercomputing, etc. So government's got a role to play. Industry's got a role to play. Industry needs to understand what sheer capacity is down the road from them. You know, in our Australian universities, we punch above our weight. We are good at research, it's measured, we know how to measure it, and every study after study, or exercise after exercise, tells us that Australian research, given we're such a small population, we perform extremely well. There are things, though, that universities need to do differently. And, you know, we are somewhat, as some of you will have heard me say before, somewhat impenetrable. It's a bit kind of hard to work your way around Australian universities. They're kind of big, and people have got a sense there's all sorts of exciting things happening there, but I don't know who to talk to. So we've got to make the front door much clearer. We've got to change the culture and how we reward staff and recognise their achievements by saying, we want you to be involved with industry, we value applied industry relevant work, and we're going to recognise that when you go up for promotion. So there's some cultural change. We've got to prepare our PhDs for careers outside of academia, prepare them for the kinds of skills that they can bring into industry. But I think we've also, and I think in Western Australia we've got the capacity to do this. And I was struck when I was reading Peter Coldrake's recent book about the higher education sector. MIT, which is, you know, often the institution that's put up as being the best in this space, only actually gets 19% of its research funding from industry. But what they are is an absolutely core part of a connected innovation ecosystem. You don't know, if you go and visit Boston, you don't know where MIT begins and ends. There's startups, there's all sorts of knowledge-based industries that want to be there because of the clever kind of people that are at MIT, the students and the staff. So I think there's much that we can do in that space, making our campuses more open, more accessible, having other entities on campus with us. And then I guess finally, and this is where the ATN, so the Technological Network of Universities in Australia, where we've been very focused, is making access to IP much easier, using common templates, not getting tied up in some great long legal debate around with our lawyers and other lawyers around how to access our IP. Let's get the IP out there, open as possible, common templates, easy access, and certainly the ATN has been leading in that space, and we're very keen to keep doing that.
So there's a couple more things we talking about, but I think I might just pause there and give the audience a bit of a go.